Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you can all be seated, please. Nice to see you all tonight. Thank you for joining us with our guest speaker, Bruce Hoffman. With the character of Al-Qaeda having changed after the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, Bruce Hoffman is here today to talk about the threat that we face today and what it's likely to look like in the future. Bruce has been studying terrorism for nearly 40 years, and he's the director of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. He was scholar in residence for counterterrorism at the CIA between 2004 and 2006, and he held the corporate chair in counterterrorism at RAND and was the director of their DC office. He's also the co-author of The Evolution of the Global Terrorist Threat from 9/11 to Osama bin Laden's death, as you see in the back, and I see some more signed books in the back. And I believe that a new book is coming out in February that is totally written by him and is almost as big, if I'm not mistaken. And it's called Anonymous Soldier, which sounds very interesting. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Hoffman.
Thank you, Farah, for an extremely kind introduction. Let me say first how delighted I am to be back in Houston. I came and addressed the World Affairs Council in January 2010. Unfortunately, the terrorist situation hasn't gotten any better since then, and I'll explain why. Not quite 4 years ago, but I would say 3 years ago, especially as a result of the so-called Arab Spring and the transformative developments that and the transformative developments that swept across the Middle East and North Africa. Many argued and many believed that Al-Qaeda and the entire jihadi movement was in a state of terminal decline. I mean, after all, 4 years ago, or 3 years ago rather, its founder and leader, Osama bin Laden, had been killed in Abbottabad, Pakistan, in a raid conducted by US Navy SEALs. This set in motion a chain of events that resulted in the elimination of Al-Qaeda's top leadership, almost everyone except for the co-founder of Al-Qaeda and now the leader of the group, Ayman al-Zawahiri. More than half of Al-Qaeda's top commanders were subsequently killed as a result of the ramped up US drone campaign, both in Pakistan and in Yemen. And over 200 fighters were eliminated as well in those attacks. So Al-Qaeda appeared to be in terminal decline, and as the Arab Spring unfolded, many saw Al-Qaeda as having been rendered completely irrelevant by those events. Many argued that civil protests had achieved what the terrorists had manifestly failed to deliver, that Al-Qaeda's killing of Muslims had arguably alienated its base and ended any support for terrorism across the region, that Al-Qaeda, moreover, had lost the war of ideas and the struggle for Muslim hearts and minds, and in fact that the longing for democracy and economic reform had trumped repression and violence. And indeed, in the years since bin Laden's death, and as the Arab Spring continued, we were repeatedly assured by almost every senior official in the US intelligence community, and indeed in Washington up to the president, that Al-Qaeda itself was on the verge of strategic collapse. In fact, that was exactly the term that was used. How different it all looks today, especially in November 2014. First, core Al-Qaeda is present in more places today than it's ever been in the past. In fact, Al-Qaeda is present in some 17 countries or maintains at least 17 substantial networks across the globe. I mean, this is nothing less than astonishing. 4 years ago when I was here, for example, Al-Qaeda had a presence in perhaps no more than 8 countries throughout the world. So basically in the past 4 or 5 years, Al-Qaeda has been able to not only expand, but double its presence. Now, this is interesting in 2 respects. First is, as some of you will know and may have attended his lecture, Peter Bergen was here in January. In fact, I was scheduled to speak to you, but unfortunately was ill and couldn't come. Peter, and if you heard Peter, Peter has a completely different perspective on this than I do. Peter really thinks, and he may well be right, you have to make your own conclusion, but he thinks that al-Qaeda is on the verge of strategic collapse, that even though it's spread, that these are mostly local threats and so on. But you'll see almost everything that I'll tell you tonight, if you were at Peter's lecture in January, we disagree with. But there is one thing that both of us agree on completely, and that's that al-Qaeda is present in more places today than ever before. And that, to me, is fundamentally worrisome. And it's worrisome for the second reason. I mean, think about what has been occurring throughout the world since 2008. Economies have been shrinking. Government has been downsizing, not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes when it affects our security, it may be cause for reassessment. All agencies, organs of government are being asked to do more with less. Many federal agencies, including the U.S. military, are shedding personnel. In fact, the U.S. Army will decline to its smallest force since the end of World War II, and even on top of those already sizable reductions, it was announced in May that an additional 10,000 troops would be released from service by the end of this calendar year. And again, on top of the existing decreases, another 20,000 are earmarked to be dismissed or honorably discharged from the service in 2015. On the other hand, in January alone, according to one of the most authoritative non-governmental organizations monitoring the civil war in Syria, in July alone, 6,000 persons joined what I'll call ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or as they style themselves these days, just the Islamic State. So while the world has been downsizing, al-Qaeda has been growing, and not only has al-Qaeda grown, but this resurgence of al-Qaeda produced the split that resulted in the creation of ISIS and then its expulsion from the al-Qaeda fold at the beginning of this year. So that's the second worrisome development. The third one is that the jihadi message of intolerance, of violence, of terrorism, of repression, whether coming from al-Qaeda or coming from ISIS, unfortunately continues to find an audience, not just across the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, but almost worldwide. And this is the phenomenon of foreign fighters that we've seen. In my analysis, I think there's two reasons why this message still resonates, why the ISIS brand especially now is so attractive, but also the al-Qaeda brand as well. We call al-Qaeda in the Levant, in Syria and Iraq, Jabhat al-Nusra, the Nusra front, the struggle front, but it's the same as al-Qaeda. I think there are two reasons. One is that both groups, in an unmitigated fashion, al-Qaeda now for at least 3 or 4 years, ISIS for the past 2 years, has been promulgating a message of unbridled sectarianism. In other words, their core ideology depends upon or relies upon stirring up or indeed prosecuting the centuries-long, age-old struggle between Persian and Arab, and Shia and Sunni. And this has become the main rallying cry. So it's very much a message of religious intolerance within Islam and disagreement over the Prophet's succession, after all. So this has proven enormously important and has struck many people across the region in a very visceral and personal way, where they have flocked to defend the Sunni against what they see as a Persian or Iranian plan backed by the Shia in Iraq and in Lebanon, essentially to take over the world. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is, as many of you will have read, is the explosion of social messaging and the power of social networks these days. It's indeed these eminently accessible means of communication. Basically what all of our kids are using on a regular basis. Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, Kik, the list goes on. And the power of this, I think, is twofold. On the one hand, it enables terrorists to reach a far larger and far broader international audience than they've ever had access to before. In this respect, too, it's not terrorist leaders foaming at the mouth, issuing very turgid, often very abstruse clarion calls to battle, But it's individuals who have left their own countries, who have gone to fight in Syria and Iraq, communicating with their peers and their friends, with their own demographic group back home, in a very familiar, in a very accessible, and in essence, a very assuring patois or means of communication. Now, the terrorists portray this as a spontaneous outpouring of people who go to Iraq or Syria and want to communicate and rally their friends, families to battle. But there's two elements of this that I think underscore the power. Firstly, with this social media, once you can tap into your friends, you then have access to the friends of your friends and the friends of the friends of the friends. So there's these radiating outwards concentric circles of individuals you can reach. Same thing in Twitter. So you not only reach the followers, but you reach the followers of the followers and the followers of those followers. So you have a message that very quickly, very inexpensively, and sometimes permanently, it's often very hard to erase these things, reaches a very wide audience. Second thing is that this is often portrayed as the sort of the spontaneous communications of these individuals who are extolling the virtues of the paradise that they're finding in Syria and Iraq, the bond of brotherhood. In fact, I follow a lot of these. Many of these leaders have in the tens of thousands of followers, many of just ordinary foreign fighters who have left the United Kingdom, France, Indonesia even. I mean, basically they've drawn people from 81 countries throughout the world. Basically, a third of the world's countries have furnished foreign fighters to both Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Levant, which in and of itself is astonishing. But again, underscores the power of this communications platform. Well, they portray it as just individuals tweeting or posting things on Facebook. It's in fact part of a highly choreographed, deliberately orchestrated propaganda campaign that is actually undertaken by these organizations that directs these individuals to post these messages or to communicate these messages. I mean, think of it. In the middle of the desert of western Iraq, for example, where I've been, I served with the Coalition Provisional Authority in 2004, was out in Anbar province in Ar-Ramadi. I mean, there's not a lot of infrastructure there, and a lot of it has been destroyed in the fighting this summer. So just, you know, skeptically, a natural reaction would be to ask, well, how are these people? I mean, it's not like they have Cox Communications or Warner Broadband in their homes, right? They've got to get some bandwidth somewhere. They've got to make some connection. How is it that they're able to do so? And the answer is that these messages are being, as I said, highly choreographed and developed and meant to appeal to very specific audiences in individual countries. So the message that individuals from Britain, let's say, are sending back to their friends and followers and that concentric circle can be very different than the same message that is sent to people in Belgium, for example, or in Morocco, or in Indonesia, or in United States or in Canada. So they're fashioning that message deliberately to entice people. And we know, I mean, just from, you know, not so far from Texas, just in the past couple of weeks, 3 teenage girls, completely on their own, were not the victims of oppression, were not the victims of occupation. They grew up in the Denver metropolitan area, attempted to travel to Turkey and then to cross the border into Syria and to join ISIS. So this is the power of this social media. And then the fourth thing that concerns me compared to the past, or when I was here 4 years ago, is that we're now, I think, truly in a much more complicated environment and a more highly fluid and unpredictable environment. I'll give you an example of this that I'm going to come back to in my talk in a moment. The threat has grown, in essence, while our resources have contracted. Sequestration really was a body blow against the U.S. intelligence community and especially against the federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI. But also, too, there's these cutbacks when this whole environment is becoming much more fluid and much more complicated, in the sense that our allies, Australia and Britain, facing this problem of their own citizens, answering these calls to battle from Twitter, from Facebook, what have you, these apps, had the great idea they're going to stop them from leaving those countries to go overseas to fight by seizing their passports. Seemed like a great solution, policy solution to this problem. But what have we seen? We've seen instead individuals prevented from going overseas to join the fight have rather resolved to prosecute the fight in their homelands. And the first inkling of this was on the 18th of September when police in both Sydney and Melbourne, Australia, arrested a total of 15 individuals, all of whom had attempted to leave Australia to join ISIS. Their passports had been seized by the Australian Foreign Office. Rather than give up the fight, what they decided they would do was just kidnap ordinary Australians. In other words, they couldn't go to Syria and Iraq to behead captured American journalists or British aid workers. They would behead their own fellow citizens in Australia. So this was a dead serious plot. The beginning of October, British police arrested 5 individuals who they said were animated and inspired by ISIS. And in fact, I've read the propaganda by Al-Adnani, who's the ISIS spokesman, and he's quite explicit. If you can't come here to join the fight, you have knives, you have automobiles, you can push people onto subway tracks, prosecute the struggle that way. So those 5 individuals were arrested, and what the British police describe as a significant terrorist attack against British citizens was derailed. And of course, we have the events over the past 2 weeks in Canada, where indeed in Quebec, an individual did use his car to run down two Canadian soldiers, killing one of them and seriously injuring the other. And then, of course, was the shooting at Parliament just last week from an individual who also had not been given a passport to go overseas. So, more enemies, in essence, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. All the Al-Qaeda affiliates and associates are franchises, a much more complicated, fluid environment where even the most commonsensical, or at least patently commonsensical or apparently commonsensical solutions backfire, and at a time when we have fewer resources than at any other time since the September 11th, 2001 attacks to put against this threat. Why is the threat so profound today? Well, there's one big reason. ISIS has achieved what bin Laden had only promised but had never been able to deliver. And that's, in fact, ISIS has achieved what no nation state in the Middle East has been able to do since the end of World War I. And that is to redraw the map of the Middle East. I mean, ISIS, for all intents and purposes, at least for the time being, has erased the border between Iraq and Syria, and thus taken that part of the Middle East and been able to achieve its long-term aim, which is the same as Al-Qaeda, and that's to recreate and reimpose supranational or transnational religious rule over that territory. And that's the importance of their establishment of what they call as the caliphate. In my view, the threat is not local, nor are the aims of either Al-Qaeda or ISIS completely parochial. In fact, my analysis, no Al-Qaeda threat has ever remained entirely local, even if it started that way. It's always become a regional threat with cross-border attacks and subversion of the region, and it's also become an international threat and challenge. Perhaps not always in success, fortunately, in successful international attacks, but at least in attracting foreign fighters, which is not a new problem, but one that's now, because of social media and the sectarianism, I would argue has become much more entrenched than at any time in the past. But also in terms of international finance as well. I mean, in other words, having multiple sources of finance across the world. So all these threats eventually become regional and, in fact, international ones. And in this particular case, I think in the first instance, we'll see the spread of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Levant beyond Syria and Iraq to Lebanon and then to Jordan. In ISIS's terms, actually, in their propaganda, they say to Al-Qaeda, we'll divide up the world. You can have Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Pakistan, India. Where we plan to take the fight is to Lebanon, Jordan, and then to Libya, Tunisia, the Sinai, and to Israel. So they've already achieved something of a division. The threat, I don't think, will be confined to the region. I mean, certainly I think the U.S. intervention, both in Iraq and in Syria, this isn't to say it was wrong. In fact, I think it was a positive development. But nonetheless, even though we were already in the crosshairs of both terrorist organizations, this gives them greater justification or legitimization to engage in international terrorist operations. And in this sense, let me read you just a very brief quote. I don't know necessarily in Texas whether you read the New York Times magazine as religiously as we do in the Northeast, or even some people in Washington no longer read the New York Times. But if you saw the New York Times magazine this past weekend, there was a fascinating article by someone named Theo Padnos, who also is known by the name, perhaps more familiar is Peter Theo Curtis. He was actually a third American journalist who was being held as a prisoner in Syria. In fact, he wasn't held by ISIS, who beheaded James Foley and Stephen Satloff. He was held by Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda arm there. He was with them for 2 years. He converted to Islam. In fact, he eventually was freed. This was one of the success stories. The intervention of Qatar facilitated his release in September. So he was with these people for 2 years, and actually towards the end of his captivity, and as a result of his conversion and this belief that he had become more sympathetic, at least intellectually, more receptive to their message, he was allowed to spend considerable time, as this article depicts, with one of the senior local al-Qaeda commanders. And I just want to read you this brief quote from his experience in those 2 years. The Nusra Front higher-ups were inviting Westerners to the jihad in Syria, and I'd say this applies to ISIS as well. Not so much because they needed more foot soldiers. They didn't. They already had enough. But because they want to teach the Westerners to take the struggle into every neighborhood and subway back home. They want these Westerners to train their 8-year-olds to do the same. Over time, they said, the jihadists would carve mini Islamic emirates out of the Western countries, as the Islamic State had done in Syria and Iraq. There, Western Muslims would at last live with dignity under a true Quranic dispensation. So the point is not to engage in scaremongering, but this is someone who lived amongst these people. And what he's saying is that this is not a local threat, that both groups have a much broader worldview. It's not necessarily a worldview that I think they have any chance of achieving, of taking over countries outside of the region. But you know, nonetheless, though, it's something that they believe in, and that certainly animates and inspires them. What also worries me about ISIS is that it's no different from al-Qaeda. And anybody who says that it is, I think, has a fundamental misreading of what ISIS is about. ISIS portrays itself as the truest, most fullest embodiment of the al-Qaeda ideals. It regularly and repeatedly praises and glorifies Osama bin Laden. It trumpets al-Qaeda's ideals, but they say, we are better prepared, we are better able, we are more daring and bolder, and thus are better able to achieve the success that al-Qaeda has promised and never has delivered. So there is very much of this competition. Also, in almost everything it does, at least in my estimation, it apes or betters al-Qaeda. Now, one of the significant developments behind the growth of al-Qaeda over the past 4 or 5 years, as I described at the beginning of the talk, was the emergence of these franchises or affiliates and associates. Now, the most recent one, the 17th, is al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. That's almost the exception to the rule, because al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, actually created that organization and gave it its impetus. But the overwhelming majority of that remaining 16 were not created by al-Qaeda. They were independent, indeed at one point local terrorist entities that for a variety of reasons decided to formally ally themselves with al-Qaeda, in many cases to swear the oath of allegiance or of fidelity, the bayat, first to bin Laden, then to al-Zawahiri. And then in some cases, this affinity was so strong they actually changed their name. So for instance, the group that was once known as the Salafist Call and Combat Group that was active in Algeria renamed itself Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. And one of the things that has facilitated Al-Qaeda's survival and its longevity has been this proliferation of franchises. But many of those franchises chose completely on their own to ally themselves with Al-Qaeda over the past years because they wanted to hitch their fortunes to what they thought was a rising star. Well, if ISIS, as I argue, so faithfully apes and attempts to better Al-Qaeda, what's going to happen when terrorist groups throughout the world, I mean, in Algeria, just like the old Salafist Call and Combat Group in West Africa, East Africa, South Asia, and elsewhere, when all of a sudden terrorist groups, as already has happened with a small cell in Algeria and with an element of the Pakistani Taliban, begin to similarly create franchises of ISIS and ally themselves with ISIS and offer to do ISIS's bidding for them. we'll see ISIS similarly become the same sort of regional and international threat that Al-Qaeda emerged as over recent years. So really, when we look at ISIS, what we see is an Al-Qaeda, as I like to describe it, as an Al-Qaeda on steroids. Firstly, it has far more money than Al-Qaeda ever had within its grasp. It already had amassed a sizable war chest of in the tens of millions from kidnapping, extortion. That was increased to hundreds of millions as it seized the Iraqi national treasuries in Mosul and Haditha and various other places this past summer. And also, ISIS, unlike any terrorist group in history, has a potentially renewable source of finance, which will not surprise people from Texas, and that's their possession of the oil fields and natural gas fields, especially in northern Syria and in parts of Iraq. And this was actually one of the things that precipitated the split between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, is the remnants or the elements that became ISIS wanted access to the oil and gas fields in northern Syria, particularly around Raqqa, which is now ISIS's capital. And it basically dislodged Jabhat al-Nusra, the local Al-Qaeda franchise there, to gain access to what they knew was a resource that they can trade and indeed do trade on both the black and gray market. I mean, astonishingly, even they sell oil and gas even to the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, their enemy. So ISIS certainly has far more money than almost any terrorist group has ever had in history, and has a potentially renewable resource that they can trade on over the black and gray market. Secondly, it has far more weaponry than probably any terrorist group in the history of mankind. It has seized an estimated 3 divisions worth of armaments from the Iraqi security forces. I have to say armaments that the United States supplied to them. I mean, think about it. 3 years ago, the U.S. was reluctant to intervene in the Syrian civil war when possibly we could have had more of an influence on events there. Certainly we would have had more knowledge and more intelligence of what was going on in Syria 3 years ago had we decided to arm the quote-unquote more moderates in the Free Syrian Army or other elements. But the main thing that held us back then was fear that our arms would fall into our enemy's hands. Well, that's already happened on a scale that really beggars belief. ISIS now has tanks, artillery pieces, surface-to-air missiles, Humvees, rocket-propelled grenades, plastic explosives, the whole panoply of weapon needed to outfit a small army, or at least 3 divisions worth of an army. Also, ISIS, I think very worrisomely, has shown itself to be very much of a learning organization. In other words, it studies the past mistakes, activities of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and seeks to avoid making those same mistakes. So ISIS, for example, unlike Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the original group that it came from, that was mostly composed of foreign fighters, that was led, as you may remember, by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was killed in May 2006. It was mostly foreign fighters, imposed a very harsh reign of repression that alienated the Sunni population in Iraq, gave rise to the Sons of Anbar, to the Sunni awakening that General Petraeus was able to take advantage of and really turn the situation around in that country in 2008. ISIS is seeking desperately to avoid making the same mistakes. With that kind of money, it's been able to bribe individuals to create a system of patronage, to provide jobs, to establish hospitals and clinics, to have religious police that, of course, impose a very strict interpretation of Islam, but also do things that have appealed to the communities of Syria and Iraq. They have their own food inspectors that go into the marketplaces and make sure that rancid meat or spoiled produce isn't being sold, that enforces prohibitions on price gouging, and that have set up schools and provided also employment opportunities. They have sometimes fairs where they're giving out ice cream to individuals, tug-of-war contests. I mean, this almost defies the reality of terrorist groups that we've known in the past. Certainly Al-Qaeda never did any of this type of activity, which is always why it was so unpopular throughout the Muslim world. But we see ISIS learning from the mistakes of the past and actively cultivating close relationships with people that they identify as their core constituency. In my view, the convention, this is something I said 4 years ago, that the conventional wisdom on Al-Qaeda has very rarely been correct. I think it's still less accurate today. Firstly, if al-Qaeda has been so degraded, and if it was on the verge of strategic collapse, how does one explain the expansion of al-Qaeda franchises across the world? How does one explain the emergence of the Khorasan group that you might have read about in September, which were core senior leaders of al-Qaeda that, had they remained in Pakistan, we would have counted as the highest elements of al-Qaeda's command structure. But what we've seen is that al-Qaeda very cleverly over the past few years was shifting its fighters and its top leadership away from South Asia to other venues. Syria was only one of them. Yemen, Somalia, and North Africa were other ones. In this respect, I think what we've repeatedly seen is that core al-Qaeda has a much deeper bench than we've always believed. Even today, amongst the remnants in Pakistan are hardcore leaders who were veterans of the struggle against the Soviet Union and the Red Army 20 and 30 years ago. Men who were blooded in battle and who have the credibility and the leadership stature to continue to command the organization. And in this respect, I think, although many commentators argued that the creation of al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent that was just announced in September was a publicity stunt, that was a desperate bid on the part of al-Qaeda's leadership to compete with ISIS, to attempt to demonstrate its relevancy, and many people wrote that off. I think that was unfortunately extremely mistaken for several reasons. First, core al-Qaeda's interest in South Asia is by no means new. In fact, last January, following ISIS's expulsion from al-Qaeda, when everyone was expecting Ayman al-Zawahiri to comment about Syria and to comment on the struggle there, his first public statement of our new year was actually about al-Qaeda's continued interest and inroads in South Asia, where he focused most of his remarks on Bangladesh, a country that hasn't experienced a surfeit of al-Qaeda activity in the past. Secondly, we see that over the past 3 years, al-Qaeda has been deliberately cultivating a very different demographic than has historically existed in the organization. From its founding, basically, its first 20 years in existence, al-Qaeda had a predominantly Arab face, where the majority of its key leaders and fighters were drawn from the Arabian Peninsula, from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, and elsewhere. Yet over the past 3 years, al-Qaeda has been deliberately recruiting within Pakistan alone, and has been specifically recruiting middle and upper middle class Pakistanis, almost always with university degrees and coming from engineering and science faculties, not humanities or liberal arts. So in other words, the stereotypical al-Qaeda fighter from South Asia, who only a few years ago would be someone relatively uneducated, coming down from the mountains, perhaps with 2 bandoliers of bullets and an AK-47, has increasingly been replaced by middle, upper middle class, well-educated Pakistanis who can blend in with modern society. For at least the past 2 years, I think remarkably, remember all those Osama bin Laden videotapes that were being released since the end of the 1990s? All those were distributed by Al-Sahab, the Clouds, which is al-Qaeda's perennially active media arm. And they were almost always in Arabic. For the past 18 months to 2 years, the vast majority of those communications have not been in Arabic, but in Urdu, the main language of Pakistan. So al-Qaeda has been deliberately remaking itself into a predominantly or at least core al-Qaeda has been remaking itself into a South Asia entity. And this, I think, dovetails with the increasing attention that al-Qaeda has paid in recent months to Muslim minorities in various South Asian countries, in Burma or Myanmar, for example, where al-Qaeda historically has not been active, has had little interest, has been tremendously active in recent months. Similarly, the Maldives, which has not seen any al-Qaeda activity, has seen an increase in recruitment, in propaganda. And we've also, I think astonishingly, in the 3 countries where we really were unequivocally successful in defeating al-Qaeda after 9/11, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, we've seen over the past year a revival of al-Qaeda activity in all 3 places. Also, as part of where the conventional wisdom, I think, has gone wrong, classic example of this occurred last winter and spring. At least the buzz within the Beltway in Washington was a very optimistic one that the expulsion of ISIS from al-Qaeda would produce a fratricidal internecine struggle that would result basically in the self-immolation of both groups as they fought with one another, as they killed one another off, and that essentially they would both neutralize one another and the threat would disappear. I think that was a fundamental misreading, too, of the history of terrorism, because what we've seen in countless cases over the past decades is that splits within terrorist movements don't result in a decrease in violence, but rather in an escalation of violence, especially as the splinter group, in order to demonstrate its bona fides, to prove its relevance, to continue to attract fighters, to siphon off sources of financial support from the parent organization, trades in what, after all, is the coin of the realm of terrorism, and that's in violence. And that what we've seen in the past is that splits drive higher levels of violence, which is exactly what occurred this past summer when ISIS stormed into Iraq and, as I described earlier, redrew those borders. So rather than this split weakening both groups, this could eventually lead to a situation where two stronger, even more resilient factors compete with one another, both targeting the U.S. and the West as part of that competition. Similarly, and somewhat paradoxically, I also, as many people in Washington have completely written off any hopes of a reconciliation or reunification, I think that is equally premature. If one follows actively the statements, the propaganda released by both al-Qaeda and ISIS, one finds repeated references to ongoing efforts on both sides significantly to achieve some modus vivendi or some understanding that would result in some form of reunification. So even what we're describing as implacable enemies, their efforts to reunite, even as I'm speaking, are ongoing. In fact, just in the past couple of weeks, ISIS released 50 al-Qaeda prisoners as a sign of goodwill. So the prospect of these two groups now reuniting and presenting a threat of even greater proportions can't be dismissed either. So how does all this happen? I think, painful as it may be, we have to admit the fact that al-Qaeda thinks strategically and that ISIS indeed has stolen al-Qaeda's strategy. And this in and of itself is fascinating. In 2005, a very important document was released by al-Qaeda. It was produced by Saif al-Adil, who was one of the leading fighters in the movement, had been involved in the 1998 bombing of the U.S. embassies, was involved in the attack on the USS Cole, was instrumental in the terrorist campaigns waged by al-Qaeda in 2003 in Saudi Arabia, for example. And he had produced, in consultation with al-Qaeda leaders, that, again, this is 2005, a 7-stage strategy to victory. Let me describe what those stages are for you. And then you can make your own judgment whether al-Qaeda thinks strategically or not. The first stage, al-Qaeda called the awakening stage, and this coincided with the 9/11 attacks. And that stage lasted from 2000 to 2003. And in its statement, it described this as reawakening the nation by dealing a powerful blow to the head of the snake in the U.S. You can check that off. They achieved that. The second phase, or the second stage they described as the eye-opening stage, which unfolded after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. This lasted from 2003 and 2006 and was designed to perpetually engage the United States and the West in a series of debilitating, enervating, exhausting overseas military ventures that they hoped would eventually bankrupt the U.S. and other countries. Well, Fortunately, it didn't bankrupt us, but it certainly led to the events in 2008 when our economy weakened. So at least in their view, they achieved that. Now we get to where they were looking ahead, writing in 2005. They described the third phase as the rising up and standing on the feet stage, which was to last from 2007 and 2010. And this entailed the proactive expansion of al-Qaeda into new, fruitful venues, including East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and the Levant. You can check that off. I mean, that also has happened. That's part of this expansion that I described. And what was fascinating, too, you may remember in May 2012, the administration released, unfortunately, it was a thimble full of documents that had been seized from bin Laden's lair in Abbottabad, Pakistan. There's literally thousands, tens of thousands, may even be a modest estimate of all the material that was on the computers that our U.S. Navy SEALs seized. But the administration released 17 documents. If you go back and look at those documents, there's one that's absolutely fascinating. It's a memo written by bin Laden in 2004 declaring that a country like Nigeria was fertile ground for al-Qaeda's expansion in the next few years. So they were very much thinking strategically, and the group that we know as Boko Haram, which of course kidnapped those 300 schoolgirls last spring, is exactly the fruition of al-Qaeda's strategy. The fourth was called the expansion phase and was a continuation of this rising and standing up phase that significantly was not completely derailed by bin Laden's killing. This entailed the exploitation of new opportunities that might be created throughout the world to topple apostate regimes. And of course, this is what the upheaval of the Arab Spring facilitated in the deposition of the Mubarak regime in Egypt, and subsequently that set in motion the Syrian civil war. The fifth stage is the one we're currently in, and that's, interestingly, titled the Declaration of the Caliphate stage. And we see how ISIS has stolen a march on al-Qaeda. Just as I said before, it apes and seeks to better al-Qaeda, but adapts its strategy. And this is a period when al-Qaeda believed Western influence, and particularly the influence and power of the United States, would be reduced and weakened. You know, for an estimate in 2005 that unfortunately is proven to be somewhat accurate, and where al-Qaeda in its hubris was confident that a new world order could be created. I mean, this reads almost like a novel, really, when you think about it, because it's unfortunately shown itself to be uncannily accurate. Sixth is what was phrased as the total confrontation stage, which would last from 2016 to 2020 and would only occur after the caliphate has been established. So this is why ISIS has attached such importance to declaring the Islamic State and resurrecting the caliphate. This is the period when al-Qaeda was convinced a transnational or supranational Islamic army drawing Muslims from throughout the world, I mean, it sounds a little bit familiar, unfortunately, would launch what they described as the decisive, quote, fight between the believers and non-believers. And then finally, they described the definitive victory stage, which would be between 2020 and 2022, when the rest of the world, and this is a quote, is beaten down by the triumphant caliphate, close quote, and where victory will come after no more than 2 years of fighting. Now, this is completely, I mean, is a strategy. It's impressive in how much it's dovetailed to contemporary events. But let's face it, I mean, this isn't even in the half-baked realm. This is in the quarter or the eighth-baked realm in terms of the reality of it, or at least of its ultimate victory ever being realized. But the point is a potent piece of propaganda. It's extremely compelling because it does adhere very closely to the way events certainly can be interpreted. And the point about propaganda is it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be believed. And as a compelling narrative, you can see why the al-Qaeda or the ISIS brand resonates to the extent that it does. How does this affect the United States, potentially affect the United States directly? And here I think it's important to even look back on the Boston Marathon attacks. About a month later, the Washington Post had a front page article that heralded America's resilience, that the United States had turned a corner, that is, in comparison to the September 11th, 2001 attacks, the United States was much more balanced, could take a punch better, was much more resilient. As a terrorism analyst, I read that and thought, this is completely wishful thinking. I mean, firstly, tragically, 3 persons were killed, but 3 persons doesn't compare to 3,000 individuals being killed within 102 minutes. I mean, it's an apples and oranges comparison to compare the two. But then let's step back for a second and look at it from the terrorist perspective, which I believe is how they view it. They see basically 2 idiots, a teenager and a slightly older brother, using a recipe for explosives involving a cooking pressure cooker that they had taken from a magazine. Not only were able to tragically kill 3 people, but these, as I said, these two idiots shut down an entire American city and closed down a major international airport. So you can imagine terrorists overseas, the professionals who have been blooded in combat in Syria and Iraq, who are much more adept and competent, who don't have to get their knowledge of bomb making from online magazines, that have learnt it in the field and perfected it. They see a teenager and a slightly older brother achieving this, and from their perspective, they think the U.S., unfortunately, still remains an inviting target. We certainly face the prospect, as Director James Comey, on his appearances on 60 Minutes, has discussed, as virtually every leader in the West has described, of foreign fighters returning to their home or adopted country. So I think this is a very real threat. Let me move to conclude. So what should we do about it? I mean, this is the tough issue, of course. And I think, though, there are things we can be doing to certainly mitigate or reduce this threat that we're starting to do now, but that we've actually, unfortunately, lost time on. First, as we are doing now, but we've been late to this, is we need to much better and much more proactively contain al-Qaeda and ISIS's geographic expansion. And we have to actively work, certainly with our allies, but we also have to play a lead role in blunting and rolling back the resurrection of al-Qaeda's capabilities and the consolidation of ISIS's. Second, we need a better capability to undertake what one might call horizon scanning, to look over the horizon, to look strategically into the future, to identify emerging groups and threats. But even if we're able to do so, I think we need to conceptualize these threats differently than we have in the past. We have to, I think, apply particular priority to the seam zones and lawless border areas and ungoverned spaces that has enabled al-Qaeda to survive and for ISIS to emerge. 30 years ago, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher described publicity as the oxygen that terrorists require to survive. But that, to me, is a very 20th century formulation. In the 21st century, the oxygen that al-Qaeda and ISIS depend on is continued access to sanctuary and safe haven, which unfortunately they've had greater access to in the aftermath of the upheaval and the instability created by the Arab Spring. But in this sense, we have to focus much better on the pressure points that sustain the movement of fighters across international borders, and also on the movement of finance that sustains and supports these movements. We also have to continue to maintain our focus and maintain our pressure on the four countries closest to al-Qaeda's revival, and in one case to ISIS's emergence, all of whom we have relations with and varying degrees of leverage. And this is Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and especially Turkey, and most importantly Turkey as a NATO ally. We need to have a residual military presence overseas, not to invade countries, not to repeat the same experiences of the past decade, but rather to strengthen and to train local allies, to consistently build up and shore up their military and police, but also when they're incapable of acting, to provide quick reaction forces and support using our special operations personnel. We need to counter their use of social media much more effectively than we're doing. I mean, it astonishes me. All these apps, all these communications platforms basically developed in this country, in Silicon Valley, or in the Dulles Corridor, or many other places in the United States where these high-tech corporations are located. But yet we're always reacting. We're always closing the barn door, in essence, after the horse has gotten out. What we should be doing now is studying what are the new social messaging techniques, what are the new apps that are in production and development now that are going to appear in 6, 9, and 12 months. And then we should be assessing, using these ever-increasing and more sophisticated and new means of communication, how might terrorists use and harness them? And before they actually appear, begin to develop means to effectively counter their use of these new technologies that we're developing before they become public, before they're actually used by our adversaries. So I think we need to get better with that. Finally, we need to, I think, depict the threat more soberly and view it as the terrorists view it, after all, as a divinely ordained, a divinely commanded struggle that has no temporal boundaries. In other words, it's a generational struggle, not a struggle that we can simply declare over by removing our troops and saying that the war on terrorism has been won. In this sense, and this was the last paragraph that I wrote in July 2013, because of course books, especially books produced by university presses, take a while to actually be published. But the last paragraph that I wrote in The Evolution of the Global Terrorist Threat is proven to be accurate. And that basically argued that the final battle against al-Qaeda and its allies and franchises, and one might say now its offshoots, has not been fought, nor has the final chapter of the war on terrorism been written. Thank you very much for your attention.
Can you hear me? There you go. That was brilliant, thank you. We've got a whole lot of questions. We'll only be able to get through a few, so starting with, in your analysis, you mentioned the Persian versus Arab divide. We often hear of the Sunni versus Shiite divide. But can you elaborate on the Iranian or Persian connection and relevance to this topic?
Well, firstly, I think you have this age-old rivalry and this age-old struggle between the centers of power, whether it was Persia or whether it was the Arab world. It was certainly sharpened in recent years, especially by the regime of Nouri al-Maliki, which unfortunately embarked on a campaign of repression against the Sunni. Almost as soon as the U.S. Withdrew its forces in 2009, of course, Maliki ordered the arrest of a vice president who was a Sunni, who was the highest office holder, and began a campaign where we see the competency of the Iraqi security forces, of the army and police, was almost completely denuded by cronyism, by placing in positions of command not people by dint of their skills, but rather by their religious persuasion. That this, in turn, the repression of the Sunni, especially in western Iraq that followed, was seen very much as, or at least was depicted and seized upon, I would argue, by Al-Qaeda and ISIS in their propaganda as a manifestation of Iran's attempt to dominate the Muslim world. Certainly the repression of Sunni by the Assad regime, and Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, which is an offshoot of the Shia, was also seen as playing into this age-old struggle of Shia dominance. And this, in essence, I think was very cleverly and unrelentingly seized upon by Al-Qaeda and other radicals as this perpetual struggle, that it was the duty of all Sunni to come and participate in this fight and to push back the tide of Iranian, what they see as Iranian subjugation. So in that sense, they have singled out Iran as their main oppressor, as behind developments in Iraq, and have said that the only way of resolving this is through clash of arms.
Sorry, apparently I need to use this microphone. Taking from that, to what extent would you say in Iraq the support for ISIS has been from Ba'ath Party members? And is it true that that support is waning, that there is now friction on the ground?
That's an excellent and very knowledgeable question, actually. Certainly, I think support from the former Ba'ath Party, from former Saddam loyalists, from former members of the Iraqi military was absolutely pivotal and critical in ISIS's lightning thrust into Iraq. There was certainly months of preparation and subversion that was undertaken by ISIS agents working in collusion with these individuals. I don't think ISIS's successes, basically almost storming the gates of Baghdad, stopping in the suburbs of Baghdad, would have been possible without that support. But here, I think the questioner really has put their finger on the nub of the problem, is that many of the former supporters of Saddam Hussein and many of the members of the Ba'athist Party were completely secular and bridle against and resent the imposition of Sharia or of Islamic law, and there are going to be these cleavages. I think, unfortunately, ISIS is very much aware of this, and this is why it has these religious police and has its own network of informants. I think, though, until the actual threat posed by the United States and Iran, as they see it, they don't see it as the same threat, but it's from two different enemies. Until that's diminished, I don't see, though, the former Baathists and the former regime loyalists necessarily defecting in any significant number from ISIS, because unfortunately in this region they want to be ruled and governed by their kith and kin and not by what they see as an infidel alien presence.
This is really combining a couple of questions. What are the messages that ISIS are sending to the young men and women, actually, And specifically for the women, for these young women coming from the UK, what are they going to? What is attracting them?
Well, don't forget, I mean, this is part of the power of social media, is that they see what other people are tweeting, and they see what the followers and friends of their fighters are concerned about or interested in, and consequently they're tailoring their messages to suit that audience. I would say in a very broad sense, and this is actually, I'm not sure why it surprised me, but it's still, maybe it bothers me more than it surprises me, is just these endless tirades against democracy and against the corruption of Western societies, where supposedly there's equality, but people who dress in traditional Muslim garb are discriminated against, are prevented from wearing the hijab, for instance, in France, where there is no equality, that democracy is just a sham. And then this escalates upwards from, let's say, tapping into perhaps the individual experiences of persons where they've experienced discrimination or racism or some form of prejudice. But then it elongates and it becomes almost these tirades against democracy, saying this is the problem, is that man cannot create law, that is inherently not just wrong, but it's unjust and it's corrupt. The only law that can be embraced is God's law. And that's the belief in the caliphate, and why the imposition of Sharia, of a very strict interpretation of religious law, is so important to ISIS. And sometimes you'll see, especially on Twitter, sometimes you'll see it in some news broadcasts, you'll see fighters going into battle raising their finger like this, is one, tawhid, oneness, monotheism is the bond between man and God, that they say if everybody adopts that outlook, they can participate in essence, this utopian society that supposedly is unfolding in Syria and Iraq, in ISIS lands. And unfortunately, many gullible people that, as I said, may have experienced some form of prejudice or some form of, even if it's not active hatred or prejudice, some form of alienation or exclusion, are almost susceptible to messages of this paradise that is being created, and to blandishments or encouragement for them to come and join, to be part of building something new, to partake in it. An unfortunately impressionable position, and impressionable young persons, and especially those who might be altruists, I mean, are attracted by this idea of being part of something larger than themselves. But this is really the cleverness of the terrorist groups that is zeroing in on precisely the demographics, whether it's young women, whether it's young men, and appealing to them deliberately and specifically in a way that they know will elicit a response that will resonate.
I think we only have time for one more. Some claim that the dispute between Israel and Palestine is the critical destabilizing element in the region. How true is that, and or has Iran taken on that mantle now?
Well, I mean, certainly the long-standing conflict between Israel and Palestine is a flashpoint in Muslim relations with the West, especially with relations to the United States. I mean, Israel is seen as the last vestige of colonialism or imperialism or Western interference or projection in the region. So we can't dismiss it as one of the causes, but that's what I would emphasize. It's one of many causes. I don't think by any means the central cause. The central cause actually of this current struggle is the sectarianism that I described as an internecine Muslim struggle between Shia and Sunni. I mean, that's really what has gained the greatest traction, at least in escalating the violence and attracting fighters. So I think it's one of many things. The conflict between Hindus and Muslims in South Asia is also an enormous fault line in Islam's relations with the West. The conflict between another age-old conflict in the Caucasus between Russians and the Muslim minorities there is yet another important fault line. So I don't think there's any one, much as we'd like to seize on one explanation or one solution to ending this kind of conflict and violence, there isn't. In the case of Israel and Palestine, I think, in some respects, as I said, it's one of many elements, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination the element. And I'll give you an example. 1998 was the apotheosis, was the pinnacle of the Oslo Accords. It's when cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority was at its zenith. I mean, there was cooperation between the intelligence agencies of Israel and the Palestinians, often brokered or superintended by the CIA. The economy of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and the Gaza, was experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The prospects of peace were almost within grasp, and of course, unfortunately, they unraveled in the 2000 Camp David Accords. But the point is, it was quite real. But that was exactly the time, after all, when Osama bin Laden was blowing up our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. So even when the prospects of peace were almost within our grasp between the Palestinians and the Israelis, that didn't matter at all to bin Laden. In his own message, conflict was the only solution, and that, unfortunately, is the message of al-Qaeda and ISIS today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.